novelty, the meaning or the value of novelty is changing. AI is changing it.
That was Dr. Adam Green, a professor at Georgetown University. I'm Keith Sawyer, and you're listening to The Science of Creativity. Dr. Green studies the neuroscience of creativity, which involves doing advanced 3D brain scans to map how the brain works during creative thought. But even more fascinating is that he's developing neurostimulation techniques that have the potential to increase our brain's creative potential. If you enjoy this interview, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and like the show or leave a comment so that other people like you can find the show. Now, here's our interview. Adam, welcome to The Science of Creativity.
Oh, thanks, Keith. Great to be here.
You've done a lot of different kinds of research, and I don't even know if we're going to get to all of your research today. So I thought I'd want to start out by asking, can you just give us an example of something you saw recently or some incredible example of creativity?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, I don't know if this is the sort of grand scale, as our good friend James Kaufman would say, big C kind of creativity that you might have had in mind. But the thing that comes to mind that is recent and mind-blowing to me and just inspiring, there's a summer camp in North Carolina where you're based,
okay.
where I grew up. And I'm still connected with it and supported. I'm actually on the board of directors for them now, but I also go and play with the kids. There's a counselor there with a group of 7-year-olds. And they were all in a field. And the intent had been to go to the obstacle course. But there was an issue with some of the harnesses at the obstacle course. They couldn't go there. And so this counselor, whose name is Jeff, one of the great counselors that I've observed, said to the kids that they could make an obstacle course out of each other. And so he built them into these structures that they had to climb on and over and jump through. And it was the coolest thing and just the most brilliant, joyful, half hour that I've spent outside of course, with my own family in quite a while. So that's what comes to mind first.
You mean the kids moved around and made themselves into the obstacle course?
That's right. He positioned them and they invented some of their own positions. It was 3 of them together in an Eiffel Tower sort of shape. And then there were, they became hurdles to jump over. You had to squeeze through 2 of them that were packed together at one point. It was great. It was really everything that's most joyful about creativity.
That could be an improv theater exercise if you put some adult actors up on stage for that.
I totally agree.
You mentioned big C creativity and little c, and that's a pretty common definition in creativity research. So give an example or just define that. What's the difference between big C and little c creativity?
Well, our mutual friend James Kaufman would be far better qualified than I am to answer that question. When I think about that, I think about creativity that's happening in everyday ways, which is most by percentage of creativity, that would be more toward the little c, and creativity that's happening in big ways that impact more than just your immediate life and those perhaps immediately around you, but that receives that kind of broad recognition. And I think somewhere in between little c and mini c, or maybe some flavor of little c that's always interesting to me is the creativity that you do for yourself, right? It's not just, am I navigating some circumstance in my daily life or solving a problem that's in front of me, but really something done with the intention of always staying in your mind. The thoughts that you think just to think those thoughts or to amuse yourself. If I was going to ask James a question about the C scale, I might ask him where that fits. And I bet he'd have a good answer.
Oh, you mean something like you just have a dream, or maybe it's imagination, right? You're just imagining something that might happen.
Something that might happen, or just variations on a song that just to amuse yourself, or thoughts related to the nature, what it is that makes quantum mechanics actually the way that we observe it. Just sort of playing with those ideas, really just for your own amusement. Or your own edification or your own joy.
That reminds me of actually one of your lines of research, which is cognitive neuroscience or brain imaging. And that is, I don't know, you can correct me if this is wrong, but you're studying what goes on inside people's brains, and they're lying still while their brains are operating while you're analyzing them. So you really are looking at something that's only in their heads. Is that fair to say?
That's right.
So what's your methodology, cognitive neuroscience? How do you image the brain, and how does that help you understand creativity?
Well, that's a great question. It's a big question, and it's a question, the answer to which is an entire field, right? Or at least a subfield, cognitive neuroscience, but also the neuroscience of creativity. For me, I think there's some nuance to the answer, actually. So you say it's just in their head, and that's right, in that what we're observing is what's happening, or some proxy measure for what's happening in the brain as the actual process of creativity, however it's construed in the particular context of a task or a game that you're playing in the scanner, as it's playing out in that context. But at the same time, I think it's the same creativity that goes everywhere. It's the same creativity that comes from your brain and goes out into the world. But where we are observing it with imaging, with neuroimaging, is, as you say, directly between your ears. And so the methodology that we often use for most of the work that I've done on the neuroscience of creativity is functional MRI. Just as you describe it, you're lying there relatively still. We hope you're still, because if you move too much, then we can't use your data. Yeah. Funny story about that, and how the first time I put my wife in the scanner before she was my wife, she really had to pee, so she was wiggling a lot. And so anyway,
that's a part of your brain that thinks about peeing. The neurons are firing.
That's true. We should use those data from her to figure out which part of your brain is where you go when you're focusing on not peeing. But yeah, so you're relatively still. You're looking at a screen. You're answering questions as they come up, or thinking about prompts as they come up on that screen. You might be asked, to do the classic alternate uses of objects kind of task, or a lot of our work has been around relational creativity in the context often of making analogical connections between things that seem far apart, or, testing the influences of creativity interventions, such as training to think creatively, but also interventions based on neurostimulation. So actually taking what we've learned from observing the brain and identifying targets within the brain, systems, different hubs of networks that we can stimulate in ways that we think will actually support creative cognition, and then look at the brain to see what's changing when those targets are stimulated. And also, of course, looking to see whether people actually are getting more creative. And that's a lot of what my lab is doing right now in a couple of different directions. But that's something I'm really excited about, looking at not just observing how creativity is happening in the brain, which is something that our lab and many people have done for a couple of decades now, but really being able to start the transition from observing to helping, to intervening in ways that actually stimulate creative cognition, and being able to look at those changes in the brain to make sure that the changes in the brain are really what's explaining the changes in creativity.
I want to talk a lot about that. And I know our listeners are, whether you call it cognitive hacking or brain hacking. But first, so when you talk about seeing creativity in the brain, it can't be this big creativity, or unless you get really lucky that someone thinks of, their Nobel Prize winning idea right when they're in the brain scanner. But most of them, it's going to be little c creativity, something that just happens in your head. And you gave an example of this distant analogy test. A couple of months ago, I had Yoed Kennett on the podcast, and he was talking about this notion of remote connections being more creative. Is that the sort of thing you're studying people doing? Is their brains just making these special kinds of connections?
That's right. Yep. And Yoed and I have worked together a little bit on some of that, and he's a good friend. I was just talking to him a couple of days ago, and we're both very interested, I think, in this notion of connecting ideas across semantic space. And with my research, that's often been in the form of analogies. And there's a long history to suggest that analogies are the basis of many big C type of creative breakthroughs and developments of new ideas. But to your point, we can't set out to study big C gosh, in the scanner, or perhaps someone will develop that study. I'd love to see it. But the problem, of course, is we need to be able to study something that we know is going to happen when the person in the 25 minutes that they're in the scanner. And so we need to be able to put something in front of them that they can think about that qualifies as interesting creativity, but that almost certainly isn't going to qualify, as like this world-changing idea. So you can think about these potential analogies I put in front of you and see which pairs of things might match with each other, even if they look different or seem different from each other. And that's about as big as it gets, because those really earth-shattering ideas, they don't come on any predictable schedule. So if you're putting people in the magnet and the scanner and paying a bunch of money to do it, it'd be a pretty risky proposition to hope for for that earth-shattering insight while you've got them in that noisy, sort of closed-up space.
I'm familiar with the methodology where your head is inside of a humongous scanner and you can't move your head, you can't move your body because neurons are going to fire and it's going to interfere with the signal. And you want to observe just the neurons that are associated with someone having that. I guess they're making an analogy. Can you give an example of, I guess you present images to them. They can still see, right? They've got their eyes open and they might be blinking their eyes or moving their eyes around, but that's supposed to be all they're moving. But what are they looking at?
Yeah, so you can show images. Yeah, you can show movies even. Typically with our analogical thinking work, we've done it in a verbal domain. And so we've shown pairs of words, and you have to sort of figure out connections between those pairs of words. So you might look at the word pair, pencil is to eraser as pen is to whiteout. And you might think, okay, yep, that makes an analogy. But then maybe if you have pencil is to eraser as memory is to amnesia, that's also an analogy. The difference is one is a connection across a slightly greater semantic distance, and they get more distant than that. You could think about head is to helmet as earth is to atmosphere. That's a little bit more distance, but you could even think about head is to helmet as skunk is to spray. And now you're getting more distant because you're talking about just that sort of abstract notion of protecting. So those are the sorts of analogies that we like to play with. And in particular, we vary them along a quantitative dimension of semantic distance. So this idea that you can map the different concepts in a language. And then once they're mapped in a high dimensional space, you can start to look at the actual quantitative distances between them. And you can build your stimuli to reflect either increasing or decreasing along that dimension of semantic distance as a proxy for more creative or less creative connections.
Exactly. When you say a proxy, it's if you have two words that are farther apart semantically and you associate them, then that would be, I guess, more creative, at least in this narrow sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. But I think, the key thing is, I think you're really getting at it, Keith, is what aspects of creativity that can be contained in that small, loud, unfamiliar tube, right, are interesting enough and have broad enough reach to allow us to say something about the kind of creativity that happens outside that tube, right? And so I think that's something that's always been interesting about analogical reasoning to me, because you look at analogies and it's more than just sort of associating words with each other. It's finding that abstract underlying connection that's hidden, that maybe other people don't see, or that certainly isn't obvious on the surface. That kind of analogical thinking goes into scientific discovery, inventions of technology throughout really the history of human innovation. So I think it's satisfying to me from the perspective of we probably can't capture that huge C event, but we probably can capture the kind of cognition that's happening when that huge C event happens, even if it's at a slightly reduced scale.
It seems to me kind of obvious that if you're thinking something different, two different things, then your brain is going to look different. I mean, that's kind of the definition of thinking, is that your brain's doing something different. So that if you have one kind of analogy in your head, different kinds of neurons are going to be firing. That's, I guess, the thoughts are realized in the brain. but you can't always see that. And if you can see that in your scanner, it's not always meaningful and useful. So can you see it? Can you actually, with your scanner brain imaging, can you see how the brain looks different with these different kinds along the quantitative spectrum? I guess that's my first question. Can you see it? And
Yeah.
then the second question is, if you can't see it, so what? Why does that benefit us?
Well, I guess then it's good that my answer is yeah, you can see it. And I'll talk about why that matters to me. So you can see it, you can see a pretty consistent change. We've identified a region of frontopolar cortex in some of our work, and this goes back quite a few years, that really is responsive to that dimension of semantic distance. So as these connections, these analogical connections get more creative, this frontopolar region, which is now been implicated in a number of different creative kinds of tasks, really seems to ramp up, really seems to respond or even prepare for more semantically distant or more creative connections. I say prepare for because one of the interesting tricks that we've found you can do is you can just tell people, get ready to think creatively, or please think more creatively now. And you start to see this region of the brain ramping up. So it's consistent with actually a lot of what we know about how the brain prepares for different kinds of cognition. In the neuroscience of vision, you can say, okay, you're going to see something over here and point to a certain part of visual space. And you'll start to see the area of visual cortex that maps onto that part of visual space ramp up and get ready for the actual function of seeing something in that place when it appears. And so, which I think is a kind of what we call priming. I think that's part of what's happening in the brain when you get that cue to please think creatively. But the reason that that's exciting to me now, I think, comes back to this notion of taking what we observe by putting people in this big, silly, expensive tube and applying it in some real way, right? And so that application, the most direct application, not the only application, but the most direct application is to say, okay, well, this is where in the brain we see this activity. This is when in a creative process, and this is the kind of activity that we see. And if you have all of those pieces of information, you can figure out when and how to stimulate that region in order to help that region support the function of creativity. So that actually, transitioning between observing and helping or intervening at the direct neural level, that's something that I think comes, you can't get there without first the observation part. So that's been an exciting sort of trend for me to see happening, not just in neuroscience, but in a number of areas of cognitive science, going from kind of what lights up to what do we do with that information and how can we help people think these creative thoughts that we'd like brains to be able to think more readily.
So you can see a difference if it's someone who is, in one of your studies, you called it a high creative achiever. So some people you might say are more creative, that their brains would light up differently, by which you mean the 3D image that you get is going to look different. And then you said that, and this is fascinating for everyone, I think, that you can stimulate someone's brain and it would make them think in a more creative way. Is that what I heard you say?
The only word I would amend is help them think more creatively instead of make them think more creatively. And the reason I say
Right.
that, the reason I say that is because actually the stimulation in general, what it's going to do is it's going to make it so that neurons in the brain can fire more readily when you call on them to fire, when you ramp up those systems within the brain, as opposed to sort of forcing them to fire. Some of this depends on which modality of stimulation we're talking about. But with the TDCS or TACS, which are two sort of low voltage forms of stimulation, that's certainly how it's working. Some of the work that we're doing now is moving into transcranial magnetic stimulation and even closed loop magnetic stimulation, such that what we're doing is we're reading brains, we're reading what they're doing using EEG, so electrical signals. And based on what's happening in real time, what that specific person's brain is doing at that specific moment, this closed loop system can stimulate in order to maximally help, not make, but help that brain get into or stay in a sort of a more creative function state, which I'm really excited about because I think for this sort of approach to work well, it has to be really personalized. I think you might have been getting at this point earlier on, but brains are very different from each other, and brains are very different from moment to moment. So the ability to personalize that sort of stimulation for the individual, but also for what's going on in their brain at that moment, I think is going to be critical for making this kind of neuromodulation, neurostimulation approach really viable.
Okay. So I think when you say closed loop, so you've got someone with the EEG, they've got a net of electrodes all over their head, so you can
Yeah,
measure the electrical activity in their brain. But you also have some way of stimulating
right,
on their scalp, right? You have some
right.
kind of electrode where you can send a current, and then you're varying that current in response to what you're reading from the EEG. Is that right?
That's right. It's a magnetic pulse in this case, but yes, that's right.
Wow, it's fascinating. And have you found that by doing that, that you can help someone be, I guess I'd say, better at something? I guess you could make them be worse. It sounds kind of scary that you're modifying someone's brain.
So
So
my sister, the poet, calls me a mad scientist for for exactly that reason. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, was there more to that thought?
no, that's it. So yeah, how does it work? And is it working in a good way? I mean, can you actually help someone do a good thing instead of helping their brain, be less creative? I guess you could help them be
Yeah.
less creative, right?
Oh, yeah. It's not hard to get in the way. It's not hard to mess things up, as with so many things in life, right? But in this case, yeah, that's why we have to be so careful. That's why we have to observe so carefully to figure out exactly the right kind of stimulation in exactly the right place. And so, I mean, in our lab, but in other labs as well, we're seeing effects of neurostimulation that support creativity. Right now, that literature is really messy. And I think that makes sense because we're still in early days. And so not every finding points in the same direction. We've had some encouraging findings with transcranial electrical stimulation, this TDCS, TACS thing that I mentioned a moment ago. We're just beginning with this closed loop TMS project, but we have another TMS project that we've collected that wasn't closed loop, where we are seeing enhancements in creativity. And that's gotten us really excited about what we can do when we're really personalizing it and really reacting moment to what the brain is doing. And then we're even sort of moving into new frontiers and excited about using focused ultrasound to stimulate or at least modulate brain function in deep lying places that are hard to reach with some of these other methods. But to your point, yeah, most of the time when TMS, this magnetic stimulation, has been used in research, it's been used to get in the way deliberately, to sort of break things on purpose and then see what changes when they break. Fortunately, they're just momentary or temporary lesions or breaks. So, people come right back. But, some of the early work that's really sort of put TMS in the consciousness of a lot of researchers related to things like knocking out language function just for a short period of time. A person can't speak, right? So that certainly can be an application of TMS to help us understand neural systems of creativity. But some forms of TMS seem to be really helpful, and we're seeing that in our lab in actually supporting creativity. So it's about figuring out when and where and how. So if you know those things, you can stimulate, hopefully with at least a reasonable hypothesis that you might be able to help.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment, because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. I can imagine this happening in the laboratory where, a subject is wearing all this stuff on their head. Do you think that there's a permanent impact, that after you go back home, then for the next week, your brain is going to be more likely to have good ideas?
It's a great question. It's kind of the question, right? So if you've come far enough down the road to believe that neuromodulation is effective, and I think that's, it's pretty clear that at least in some cases it is, then the question is, well, that's great while you're in the lab. And so the question, which is, I think, exactly what you're getting at, in order for it to matter in people's lives, it would need to be more sustained, right? And so then the question becomes, if you do this repeatedly, will you have the kinds of effects that habits of mind have, right? So we know that brains are plastic. We know that the more you do a certain kind of thing, the more the neural circuitry that supports that thing is going to strengthen. The connections between the neurons in those circuits are going to strengthen. Certainly, we're more plastic when we're really young than we are as we age, but that there's always plasticity. And so the question, and I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows yet, but I'm excited to move toward a clearer understanding of this. If you do this sort of neuromodulation and you do it in a repeated way, just like you have these repeated habits of mind or repeated, cognitive practice or creative practice, will that have some of those benefits in a more sustained way? I hope it does. And another thing that's become clear with these methods is that they're safe within the within the parameters that they're used. And so, assuming that safety profile is solid, and assuming that there's more work done over longer periods of time, we may get an answer to that question.
I absolutely believe that you can enhance creativity through exercising your brain. It's just like exercising a muscle at the gym. And one of my books, I have 120 different creativity exercises. It's called Zigzag. And I think,
Right.
if you do these cognitive activities or even something like sketching or taking notes every day, and yes, in some way, it's eventually going to change your brain because, as I said earlier, thoughts are realized in the brain. So you can't think differently without your brain operating differently. So here you're proposing a new way to exercise the brain. So you're not sitting at home doing something in a sketchbook, but you're actually doing something directly, physically on the scalp.
That's right. Yeah. Although I think it's important to say that what a lot of this work is showing us is that the stimulation is more effective when you're already doing something that is creative practice, right? That is a creative task. So again, comes back to your, I think, really helpful phrasing that I was interested in amending, which is that in general, what works best is an interaction of trying to be creative and getting this neuromodulation to support creativity. So not so much making you be creative, but helping you be creative. So in a sense, it's both of those things.
You can't just be lazy and like take a pill and not have to do anything. You just, it's not going to make you creative.
I think that's probably right. I think it's sort of like, if we want to go back to the muscle analogy, and see, analogies are helpful. Like you could try to build muscle by lifting weights, right? But you could also take some supplement that's enhancing what happens and the building of muscle when you lift those same weights.
I listened to a bunch of interviews of yours to get ready for this interview, and you've said several times that, quote, creativity is a state, not a trait. And by personality trait, I think of something that's fixed and you can't change it. But then a state, now that's something we're talking about, right? That's something where you can get yourself into a different state.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really right. So I think it's fine to think about the trait of creativity. I don't think that's wrong so much as uninteresting, at least to me, because I think, if you take a test and it tells you how creative you are, or, you take an IQ test and it tells you what your IQ is, or anything else, you run and somebody tells you how fast you are. Okay, great. So you have a number. What do you do with that? Why does that matter? How does that help us, right? And again, there are ways that we can take trait level measures and look at individual differences that may predict those traits. And it's not to sell that too short. But what's more interesting to me is the dynamism, right? Like, how can you go from being less creative to more creative? What is that state change made of? Because that's something you can go out and do. How do you go from being slower to being faster? That's something that you can do. So when we've looked at these various forms of dynamism or state change in creativity, that's really the motivation. And sometimes what that's made of, and really one of the most reliable ways to do it, is just to ask people to think about being creative, to please think more creatively. You get pretty big and reliable boosts that way. We also do work in educational context to try to develop creative habits of mind, creative ways of thinking, particularly in science, to move people into more creative states. And then, this neuromodulation stuff, going right at the brain and helping the brain go into a more creative state. And in the case of this closed loop research, helping it stay there, reading it, as well as, neurofeedback, which is also about sort of brain state and being able to observe your own brain state and keep yourself in a more creative brain state, which is something else that we're working on.
It seems like that is a pretty natural link to something else you're involved with, which is called the creative ontology project. So say a little bit about that. What is this creative ontology project?
Oh, well, this is great because we get to talk about James Kaufman twice in the same conversation.
Right.
But James and I had this idea probably almost 2 years ago, and it was the basic notion is that problem that I think everyone talks about and has for some time, but it's a tough one to tackle, which is that there are a lot of words in the creativity neighborhood, a lot of terms, and they get used in sort of interchangeable ways, inconsistent ways. And it becomes very difficult to know what we mean. And it's certainly difficult to explain what we mean when we talk about creativity and like the rigorous science of creativity to people outside the field. And I think when our terms like creativity or innovation or imagination or problem solving or insight, when these sort of terms get translated into educational spaces or industry spaces, then you're even one step removed from a source that's already disorganized. And so it becomes really hard to make theoretical progress, to operationalize these different constructs and measure them in good, meaningful, reliable ways. And so what we thought we would do is figure out what these constructs are made of, but not just us. What we thought would make the most sense is to allow the field, in some sense, to define itself. And so we took an approach that was both macro and micro. I guess it's macro in the sense that we we invited more than 200 established creativity researchers, people who really should know a thing or two about creativity, to be co-authors, to join this team. And really, the field of creativity science is not huge, as you're well aware. And so if you get 200, 220 or so of the established folks kind of on the same team, your team reflects the field and really accounts for a good amount of the field itself. And so we got all these folks together, and Keith, you were obviously part of this, and I
Right. Yeah.
certainly appreciate you being on the team. And by the way, we're getting close to having a paper to send around, but we asked everybody to do that funny little set of tasks that you did, where people generated these terms that they think are used in sort of in proximity to creativity, sometimes confused with creativity, and then to generate the components of those constructs. What are they made of, right? So is innovation made of combining things? Is innovation made of implementing things or trying things out and checking things? Is imagination made of allowing your mind to wander or being playful? What are the components of these different constructs? And by getting the components and then seeing where we agree as a field on the components of these different constructs, what it allows us to do is look across the constructs and see which components are the same and which ones are different for these different constructs. So then we have answers to some of these questions about, well, how is innovation like creativity and how is it different from creativity? Well, it's like creativity in these specific ways. It has these components in common, but it's different in these other ways. It has these components that are just, unique to innovation or certainly only in that comparison with creativity unique to innovation. So it gives us this more empirically based, but also sort of field-wide answer to some of these questions about the ontology of creativity, the structure of meanings that surrounds creativity. The other direction that we went with the Creativity Ontology Project is to take the term creativity itself and divide that up into the sort of process of creativity, because it's a term that's used to describe a process, but it's also a term that's used to describe the attribute of a product, right? A product can be something creative, right? A creative work of art, right? Or it could be an attribute of a person. Gosh, that, young woman is incredibly creative, right? And so that becomes an attribute of the person in that context, but we're using the same word and the meanings are just drastically different, right? And so really going right at that difference instead of trying to develop some definition that squishes all those different meanings together in some uncomfortable and kind of untenable way was part of what we were after with this project too. So we looked at the components of those different meanings of creativity.
Right. Far more sophisticated than just a definition, because you're always finding people say, well, how do you define creative or how do you define creativity? And you're not just doing that. You're creating a map of this big conceptual or semantic space.
That's right. And doing it in this case as a sort of space made up of the representations or the understandings of the people who spend, the nerds like us, Keith, who just think about creativity all day long and sometimes get paid to do it.
This is a great opportunity to change to our last topic, which is going to be AI and creativity. So in this big semantic space in the ontology, where would you put Gen AI?
Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah, well, I think there's still still a lot to be determined about that. So I do think when you think about creativity as the attribute of a person, I said person, but actually the way we phrased it in the ontology project was the attribute of a person/agent, right? And so that's what we specifically had in mind, is that creativity is no longer only the domain of people. I mean, we've talked about creativity in animals for quite some time, of course, but most of the creativity that we talk about has generally been considered to be a kind of a human thing. And now there's this other thing, right? And it's clearly generating things that are, or generating products, generating ideas, generating images that are creative by all the standards that we've traditionally leaned on. And I think it gets really interesting from there. I mean, I'm sure we're not the only two who think this is interesting. But one of the reasons that that's so interesting is that the tools we've used to assess creativity have leaned a whole lot on the criterion of novelty, right? Something new. And I think what's happening now that people are just kind of becoming aware of, that although over the last couple of years, the evidence on this is just becoming, really strong, really clear, is that novelty, the meaning or the value of novelty is changing. AI is changing it. And it's changing it in this way. When AI generates an idea and you see it and you think, wow, that's really new, that's very alluring. And you might gravitate toward that idea. What you don't know is that because everyone has access to these same AI systems, and because these AI systems are structured in probabilistic ways, that really new idea is new all over the place for thousands, maybe millions of people who have been querying in a similar direction as you, looking for ideas in a similar space. So what this leads us to is this very new phenomenon of common novelty, right? It's both new and common. It's throughout the history of creativity, what we've had is a really strong link between things that are novel, even things that appear novel, and distinctiveness, right? And that distinctiveness, that's a lot of the value of creativity, right? We say novel, but almost implicit in that is some degree of uniqueness or distinctiveness. But when you take that link and you weaken it and perhaps even sever it, that link between novelty and distinctiveness, you end up in a very new place. So, we react with surprise. That's often a criterion that we think of in terms of evaluating whether something is creative. And we, in our sort of local space of seeing that AI idea, may feel surprise or inspiration or these responses that we have when something new is presented to us. But what we can't see, what is actually happening at scales beyond our human capacity to see them and to process them, is this homogenization of ideas, this common novelty. And so I think where that puts us is in a brand new place where we need to rely on something beyond just our own intuitions to tell us about this criterion of novelty. I think the criterion of sort of utility or value or meaningfulness, I think that still is largely a human domain of assessing or evaluating creativity, particularly based on our own domain expertise about what may be valuable. But in terms of novelty, we're in a new place where I don't think we can assess it on our own. I think we need tools that process ideas at scale that give us guidance on what's truly distinctive and what's novel but common. Where is this common novelty? What is the AI homogenization of the idea space looking like? And also, who are the people and what are the strategies, the cognitive strategies that allow us to think outside the bots, BOTS. That's a phrase we're throwing around a lot.
I like it.
Yeah, well, thanks. Because, as a dad, anytime I can work dad humor, dad jokes into the titles of our papers or, the work that we do, then that's a win. But those strategies, those people, and in particular, the people and the strategies that work in combination with AI. So this is not ultimately a story about getting rid of AI or AI being the bad villain. And I think even if it was, it wouldn't matter, because AI, like the internet, we can argue about, is the internet good or bad? I don't think anyone thinks the internet is going away. AI is not going away. But I think where we are now is in a place of needing to be able to measure and identify originality in combination with AI. That distinctiveness that allows for sort of a hybrid co-creativity that takes advantage of all the massive power that AI has, but doesn't get sucked into that AI black hole of homogenization that involves the human in a way that leads to a place outside of this homogenized, narrow idea space, so that there's still true originality and still innovation.
I know what you mean by homogenization because I've read a bunch of your work, but I'm thinking about a high school English class. Let's say it's 10th grade, and everyone in the entire United States is reading poetry by Virginia Woolf. And then the teacher says, write a 200-page essay about the poetry of Virginia Woolf. And, all the students are going to type it into ChatGPT and cheat.
Yes.
But homogenization means these tens of thousands of essays by 10th graders, they're all going to be pretty similar, right?
That very likely will happen. And it is happening. I mean, the awareness of this, both on the academic side, but also in sort of the general public side, is increasing because people are having the experiences exactly like what you're describing. So I don't think that's even theoretical anymore, Keith. I think that is where we are right now.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's powerful research, and I wish we could talk even more about that, but we're nearing the end of our time. And I always like to end by asking my guest, can you give our listeners some practical advice or like an exercise or something they could do in the next week that might enhance their creativity?
Well, I've got a couple. One is this. So I was at the meeting of the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity. This was in Paris a few weeks back. That's going to be my second recommendation, actually. So I'll just spoiler. I'll just
Right. Go to Paris.
Go to Paris. Oh, lovely. Oh, that was beautiful. But also get involved with SFNC, because SFNC is this organization of people thinking about these things all over the world, and being in that group leads you to be more creative. That's been my experience. But I was talking to some other researchers there, and we were talking about the fact that when you do interviews, often, particularly with popular media, often they want there to be like a trick, right? You do these two things and you'll unlock all your creativity. And I think we do need to be kind of cautious about that. But at the same time, what we all were sort of converging on that at least works for us, it certainly works for me, and I can maybe tell a little story about why it does work, is to go outside, go for a walk or go for a run, but do it in a place that's familiar to you. Now, you might think, well, we should be going to see something new to inspire creativity, right? We often, have that sort of association of, gosh, I saw this new thing and it sort of opened my eyes. That's, it's a very good way to approach creativity, but you can't do that as a practice every day. That's very difficult. The thing about being in a familiar place, moving around and being outside, so there's some places to put your external attention, but being outside in a place that's very familiar, and this might work in inside places too. I just tend to run outside. But when you're in a familiar place, your external attention is not required too much, right? And the reason that that's important is that creativity often derives from inspiration that we get from the outside world. But ultimately, coming back to where we started with this conversation, Keith, it's happening between your ears, right? That it's the internal focus of attention. It's being able to direct your attention toward your internal representations. That's where you take those representations and you do something with them. That's where you originate something. That's where you create, right? If it's just the experience going right through you, then you're a camera. A camera isn't creative. But the photographer can be creative. When we are out in the world and things come into our awareness, ultimately, it's what we do with those representations that is the creation, right? And so that focus of internal attention, when you're in a place where you don't have to pay attention too much to where you're going, to like, okay, wait, I don't want to trip on that. I don't want to fall in the lake. Where does this trail go? When you're in a place for the first time, there's a lot of demand on your external attention. That's great in a number of ways. But if you can start a walk or start a run with some question that you're thinking about, but you're in a familiar place so that your feet are just kind of doing their thing and your internal attention can be as focused as you need it to be without an unexpected interruption, that's where a lot of creativity happens for me. And it was fascinating or really interesting, or I don't know, maybe validating to talk to these other wonderful people whose creativity I greatly respect, and to hear that they have a similar experience or similar sort of advice that they give.
Well, Adam, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and thanks for being on the Science of Creativity.
It was great, Keith. Thanks so much.
This was a fascinating conversation. I enjoyed learning about Dr. Green's research. You can tell that the research has potential to help us understand creativity and even to enhance our creativity. He's such a prolific scholar that we only had time to scratch the surface of everything he's involved with, from cognitive neuroscience and neurostimulation to artificial intelligence and creativity. We didn't even get to his studies of education and teaching and creativity. I put his webpage in the episode notes, and that's where you can learn more about his research. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.